Okay. Getting everything set up here. All right. So we are going to get started. So good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Landau Beispiel, and I'm president of Loyola's chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. I want to start by thanking our speaker, Mandisa Moore-O'Neal, for being with us tonight. I also want to thank my fellow members of the NLG e-board for working hard to put this event together. And I want to thank everyone on this call right now for being a part of this important conversation. Tonight is the first event in Loyola NLG's Imagining Victory weekly speaker series. We hope you'll join us again next week, Thursday at 5 p.m. for Professor Bill Quigley. And since tonight is the first event in our series, I want to briefly introduce the series as a whole. And I do so with an affirmation, an observation, an invitation, and a challenge. So first, an affirmation. I affirm the slogan of the National Lawyers Guild, human rights over property interests. These 5 words, I think, encapsulate the values that motivate us to be here tonight, as well as 5 words can. Second, an observation. Those of us who would affirm these values, by and large, lack political power in the world today. Third, an invitation. I invite you, we invite you to imagine a world in which this is not the case, in which we actually have the power to implement our agenda in a substantial way. And finally, a challenge. What is our agenda anyway? Can we actually translate abstractions like social justice into an enforceable legal framework? To put it another way, we know how to protest, but do we know what we would do if we actually won? To promote reflection on this question, all of our speakers in our Imagining Victory series have been given the same prompt to speak on, and I'm going to now read that prompt to all of you so you all know what it is. Here it is. Imagine that you have the ability to single-handedly alter the laws of the United States so as to facilitate the creation of a just social order. Describe with as much specificity as possible the changes you would make to an area of law of your choosing. In laying out your vision, be both utopian and realistic. Be utopian in the sense of imagining that your maximum program for change can be fully realized and that any opposition can be overcome. Be realistic in the sense of imagining a legal framework that is actually enforceable, i.e. that would provide specific and meaningful guidance to courts and relevant government agencies. So that's the prompt. And I'm very excited to hear our first response to that prompt tonight. And so I'm going to turn it over to Gautami to introduce our speaker. Is Gautami on the call? Well, how about that? Giuliani, are you able to?
Yes, of course. I was about to just jump in myself.
Oh,
hey, y'all.
Okay, go for it.
I'm so sorry. I'm not on video right now. But I am very, very honored to introduce Mandisa Moore-O'Neal, someone who is an amazing person that I know personally. She does really great work around HIV criminalization here in Louisiana. And she just has so much passion and love for her city. It's one of the things that I really admire about her. And so I'm really, really happy that she could attend our talk today. And so I leave the floor to Mandisa.
Hey, can folks hear me? This Zoom shit is so wild. So yeah, it's many reasons why I am not a professor, and one is that I curse like a sailor. So it's recorded, but it's going to make it spicy, so that'll be good. So the first thing I want to just say is how much time, so I can just make sure I'm structured, because it's important to have like question and answer time. So
we had planned to end at 6. If you wanted to go longer than that, we could, but the plan
no,
was 6.
That's fine. So I'm gonna engage in my own accountability and have a timer, And I'm also asking that if someone can just check in and be like, hey, it's about 5:30 or whatever, but I'm going to try and hold myself accountable as well with time. So I'm Mandisa Moore-O'Neal. She, her, hers are my pronouns. I have lived in New Orleans my entire life. I actually went to undergraduate at Loyola and made the decision, which I'm still sort of sitting with, of attending LSU for law school. I am a Black feminist attorney who is really interested in talking about abolition with basically any and everybody. I'm a Black lesbian, and I'm really excited to be in this conversation. Like, as soon as I read the question, hey Nandi, I was ecstatic. I had all of the thoughts, and so I'll start here. Have folks ever heard of the term partus sequitur ventrum? It's a Latin word, as you may have figured out. So partus sequitur ventrum is a legal theory. It literally translates to that which is brought forth follows the belly. But what it meant in the US is enslavement follows the womb. It is a legal theory that was actually, it existed, especially interesting as far as us being here in Louisiana, it existed in Roman civil law. It didn't exist in English common law. It was actually introduced. And I would posit that it is a legal theory that has implications to this very day. And I think like the part that's really interesting is in this legal theory, we see the constructions of race and the constructions of gender and class in terms of enslavement. Like it essentially said, and it meant for enslaved people on either sides of the Mason-Dixon line that enslavement followed the mother. Now, on the surface, it's some clear reasons why white enslaved owners want to ensure that enslavement followed the mothers. Obviously, it's because of rape and the sexual violence that occurred on a massive level in terms of white owners and Black enslaved women. But the implications of that are super intense as of now. Have folks heard of Elizabeth Key Grinstead? She was a Black woman in the 17th century who actually sued for her freedom and won. It was actually one of the first cases that we see of enslaved people suing for their freedom and winning. I don't think it was super common, and it also wasn't super rare at the same time. It's also something that isn't really talked about, much like insurrections and rebellions and revolts that were very common of enslaved people demanding and fighting for our freedom. It's also not a narrative that's shared very often, and it's a reason why, of course. And her case is super interesting in that her argument as to why she was free is that her father was an Englishman. And under English common law, and this is Virginia, side note, I'm always so intrigued, like when people who live in Virginia, I don't know if anyone here lives in Virginia or knows somebody who's from Virginia, not lives, but is from Virginia or knows somebody from there or the DC area. Folks get really offended when you offer Virginia is the South. Like, have folks heard that? Like, I know many folks would be like, no, it is the mid-Atlantic. And it's very clear that there are implications and that there is, you know, it's seen as super racist and super backwards and Trumplandian and all of these things. And what's so funny as far as Virginia, so much of what we understand about enslavement and race comes out of Virginia. Like literally, they were like the first courts to like construct race as we're still contending with to this day. The Civil War ended in Virginia. The seat of the Confederacy was in Virginia. It's a reason why like the first 5 founding fathers were from Virginia and owned enslaved people. You know, it's a reason why it's called the Virginia Compromise. So it's really interesting like that people have this need to distance themselves from this history that has like literally structured our entire country. Side note. So all this took place in Virginia as well. So she argued that she is the daughter of an Englishman, and under English common law, which said enslavement like followed the father, or like other way of putting it, if a father is free, so are the children. She argued and won that she is not enslaved and her child, because since she was free, her son had to be free. And so it was like a super amazing case. And within days, what did the Virginia House of Burgess pass? Laws that said, in contradiction to English civil law, English common law, that enslavement would follow the mother. So let's talk about how we like engage cases. I'm going to come back to that, but in terms of, it was this amazing victory that then this policy came and essentially made it clear that no one else could really benefit from this theory that was able to get her freedom. So essentially it made it harder for others to then use this theory to have their freedom. Also in Virginia in the 17th century, have folks heard of Bacon's Rebellion? What have you heard, Kent?
I heard that the Bacon Rebellion was a rebellion, but the people that were rebelling were both were people that were like contracted labor and unfree labor of different kinds, and that the way that the rebellion was broken was the governor basically said, if you're white, you will be free eventually, and was able to split the rebelling group by causing that fissure. That's
literally what we call the construction of race. Like when we say that race is a construct, it's not something that like people who believe in racial justice just made up. Like it was constructed, and like here's an example of like when. because the white ruling class, who have always been in the minority, saw very quickly what happened when Africans, the many indigenous people who had not been killed via genocide, and poor European workers got together and revolted. And they had to ensure that never happened again. And one of the ways they did that is constructed what we now understand as these ideas of race that we still believe are biological or have these biological aspects of it, right? So I would say that these two events, the Bacon's Rebellion and the aftermath, and Miss Grinstead's case and the construction and the embedding of Pardis Sequitur Ventrum, were really impactful in the founding of this country. And they are continuing to be impactful in terms of our laws, our policies, our practices, and our customs. I would even say, and please push back, and I want to hear what people think, that there is not an area of law that we are currently engaged in that is not influenced by partus sequitur ventrum. If we look at criminal laws, if we look especially at family law and like ideas like of the criminalization of Black motherhood in particular, Black parenthood, and especially of motherhood, if we look at property laws, like literally most of what, especially here in Louisiana, which was the hub of the domestic enslaved persons trade, right? So after 1808, folks say is when the slave trade ended. Wrong, the international enslaved persons trade ended, which of course it still happened illegally, and it meant that the domestic enslaved persons trade increased. And guess what port city was like the hub of that? Side note, if folks have not, it's worth taking the tour, a hidden history tour by local brilliant historian Leon Waters, where he takes you around the quarter and Tremaine shows you like this history and a history of enslavement and of trading, and also like the history of African and indigenous resistance as well. It's just powerful. So yeah, like property in particular, because, you know, enslaved people were property and expensive. Who was that tour guide? Leon Waters. And the tour, it's okay, is a hidden history tour. So one of the things I was going to do is make kind of a bibliography, but my way, where it's not just books. And I'm going to send that out, like, and include the stuff that I'm saying as far as some readings I suggest, some films, articles, and include things like the tour. But yes, Hidden History Tour, I think LLC, if you Google it. Contracts, I would even say maritime law, in terms of like, it was through shipping that all of this happened. And much like enslavement has changed in terms of, you know, if you look at the 13th Amendment and how it has outlawed slavery except as a punishment for crime, I would also say that how partus sequitur ventrum looks has shifted. But the idea is still the same, that it's necessary to control Black bodies in order to instill these really racist, classist, sexist ideas of order. And how do we see that in today's sort of landscape? Well, there is the war on drugs, which historically has not been a war on drugs. It's actually been a war on poor people, particularly poor Black and brown people. Especially like the impact it had on people who were Black mothers and Black caretakers, as people who were ourselves criminalized and also had to have an undue burden after like people who they, who were their fathers and their partners and their brothers and their sons were also put in cages. We see it now in terms of this war on trafficking, in terms of how we are conflating sex work and trafficking, and the implications it has for Black women and femmes, and people who maybe aren't even Black women and femmes who are perceived as such. In terms of, so if partus sequitur ventrum says that enslavement follows the womb, it means there's a vested interest in making sure those wombs are producing as much property as possible, right? How has that not changed? How is there still an investment in controlling who is able to birth, under what are the conditions, how many, and how can I make sure that it's happening in the ways that I have dictated. Yeah, I would say that that hasn't changed. Like, I'm thinking of a local story of a former colleague, and Davida, she probably knows this story. She was co-counsel in a case of a local alleged drug kingpin, right? He was said to be responsible for tens of murders and drug trafficking, all of these things. And what was so interesting, this is right here in the Eastern District. What was so interesting is at his hearing, at his sentencing, almost the entire time, you know what's happening? The judge is lecturing his mother about her birthing this animal, this monster, this villain. And I remember reading the transcript and just being, and hearing it from my former colleague who's one of his attorneys, and just being like, this is so deep. We are seeing this construct play out in terms of Black women, Black mothers being blamed for a situation that they didn't always have control over. And how did that start somewhere, and how we seeing this impact now? I'm thinking of Davida as well in terms of after Katrina and the fights around public housing and trying to keep open certain housing projects, which if you're new to the city, you probably never heard words like Iberville or Lafitte or St. Bernard, because those, unfortunately, those buildings don't exist anymore, even if the people who live there and the culture that we produce still does. And Shana Griffin, who's a Black feminist and sister and mentor of mine, she and I would read the NOLA.com comments, where folks, trolls have all the things to say about the public housing and all of that. And it was so interesting that almost all of the comments had to do with they should be torn down and stay torn down because we don't need any more of these babies being born. It's so clear that it's these narratives that is so connected to birth and children and reproduction that even if people aren't aware, that's the paradigm that they then are engaging in. If we look at histories of reproductive violence, that is directly, again, is connected as far as this legal theory. Right now, it's a lot of well, maybe not a lot, it could be more, but some conversations happening because a whistleblower who was a Black woman came out and said that ICE concentration camps, whatever you want to call them, are sterilizing women there. Unfortunately, that shit wasn't new. And for somebody who's been doing this work for about 10 years, I was like, I remember 10 years ago people saying this stuff. And they were going off work that was 10 years ago. Sure, it wasn't ICE, because ICE didn't exist, 20, 30 years ago. But this idea of controlling the sterilization of people who have been deemed as disposable is actually not new. It actually has its history in enslavement and in the genocide of First Nations people, because how literally else are you able to claim land, aka property rights, right? If people live there and have stewardship of the land. I also think of the welfare Reform Act of '96. How many people know that most of the abstinence-only funding that we contend with was actually funded via the Welfare Reform Act? The whole title, and I have to read, I never remember, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Because it was very clear, the whole history of welfare is an example of enslavement follows the womb, because when chattel slavery as we knew it shifted into what's now the prison industrial complex, how our bodies were controlled shifted as well. And maybe suddenly it wasn't in the best interest to make sure that Black wombs are producing all of these property, right? And so it's so interesting that 60s, 70s, it becomes these welfare queen constructs, right? Which is how we get the 1996 thing that is called by us the Welfare Reform Act, but this is the full title, which its premise is if single Black women, single poor white women, single women, you know, who have children, like if poor people just knew how to be abstinent and to wait until marriage to have children, that would stop the economic toll of welfare. Like, it's really perplexing. You know, like this idea that a poverty can exist in a traditional, quote unquote, two-parent household. Again, it, you know, much like enslavement, it blames poor people for problems that poor people didn't actually start. Like, all in this name of being a civil citizen. So all of that to say, that's the law, and like I would want to shift. And I understand that it's not a law in the sense of it's not a one piece of legislation I can point to and say, yes, we need to get rid of it. But if we actually attack all the ways that this shows up in laws and policies and customs, it would really impact what people have as a quality of life. Right, like I'm also somebody who's an abolitionist. I've been an abolitionist for a very long time, much longer than I've been an attorney, honestly. And, you know, this is a very weird moment that we're in, right? Like in terms of, I would say, like, my experience is more people than ever are talking about abolition and defund in these ways that are simultaneously super exciting and super upsetting, because it also means that, you know, if MSNBC is pushing a defund strategy, that's probably because it's been watered down. And I like MSNBC, and I don't believe that they are the example of abolitionist politics. So it's a way that our stuff has been co-opted. But all of that to say, if we talk about defund as a possible strategy to abolition, how do we make sure that, like, if we take this theory that is still happening, is still present, is still a part of how we are resisting these laws and like how people are living and trying to survive, it's essentially a divestment strategy. It's essentially this way of saying how we funded societies built on policing and criminalizing and controlling not only people in cages, because that's a very clear way, but not the only way, but people outside of cages. Because if we look at the Department of Children and Family Services, that's a huge way that many people in our communities are experience state violence in terms of this very Protestant work ethic, white supremacist way of seeing parenting, you know, of seeing what makes a stable family. Thank you. I just saw it was 5:30. I was like, okay, I have to wrap it up. It's things that's really impacting how so many of our people are living. And even if we aren't the ones who are directly impacted, these ideas also limit the things that we can do. So in summation, I'll just say that looking back to Miss Grinstead's case, it was such an amazing case. It was such a clever argument that she had, and it was successful. And how many times have we seen an individual victory lead to really harmful, really violent, broad-based public policy? So how do we make sure, not so much that we maybe don't bring these individual cases, but how do we make sure that we aren't using individual cases as the bases of like broad-based public policies, and how we able to anticipate and predict based on a Black feminist understanding of history that even if we do get this victory, here are the possible outcomes and ways that it could impact other people, and be prepared for that. As opposed to what happens sometimes of just stopping at the victory, right? And saying, great, I did it, I'm done. And being like, okay, this was great in this family, but how do we acknowledge other people who could possibly be impacted? An example of this is in terms of work happening in the HIV criminalization world, where like we also see like right now in terms of what's happening as far as local efforts to defund. So maybe for our client, it was helpful to have them get an ankle monitor. That's very different than saying, instead of jail, everyone should get ankle monitors, especially as we know that's not stopping the ways that people are criminalized and policed. And it's okay if something benefits our client and that it not be the same as something that needs to be pushed as an example for everyone else. I also think that history has a whole lot of examples of the ways in which we have to be careful like in how we construct things. So I think that was a lot, but I want to have time for question and answers or just comments, thoughts.
All right, thank you so much. So yeah, we're gonna invite everyone into the conversation for questions and comments now. So for the audience, there's two ways you could do this. You could either click the raise hand button and I can recognize you and you can say your question or comment, or if you put something into the chat, I can ask your question for you. So we're gonna start off with a question in the chat from Rebecca. She asks, can you tell us a little more about the work that you do and examples of how you execute legal strategies around construction of laws?
Okay, so the work that I do. Oh, well, I'll say this. Prior to law school, I was an organizer. I was involved in the anti-violence world in particular. Particularly, I was looking at reproductive justice and the ways in which public policies or potential laws impacted people. So for example, after Hurricane Gustav, which was in 2008, so 3 years after Katrina and Rita, where folks had evacuated, of course, unfortunately it hit Baton Rouge a whole lot more than it hit us. A legislator, he decided it would be a brilliant idea to suggest legislation that would do two things. It would incentivize by paying $1,000 to poor women to be sterilized. At the same time that it would incentivize richer, more educated, these are his exact words, families to have children. And like we mounted like a whole campaign against that. We're like, this is eugenics. You can't like bribe people. Like right now in a state that has no safety net, $1,000 is like people not being like having housing for 2 months, things like that. And he just kept trying. He was like, okay, well maybe I know what I'll do. I'll include men and women. So like that men can be sterilized. So he thought like that would stop a equal protection argument, right? Because both genders, clearly it's more than two genders, but like would have access, all these weird things. So we were interested in like campaigns around that, and also actually going to the legislator to talk about why it's a fucked up bill. And we talked some about like bringing a suit or whatever. But one of the things that was very clear to me was one strategy isn't the only way to go. You know, like I learned very clear before law school that one way of doing this isn't the way to ensure we get the things that we need. So that's how I lawyer. Like, so if I'm bringing a case as a part of a team that's bringing a 1983 action, I'm making sure that our clients are connected to folks doing organizing, right? Like that our clients have opportunities to tell their own stories, because what the law says we can tell, even with brilliant minds, is never going to be someone's full story. So how do we make space to acknowledge, it's like our clients like have like a YouTube video like that has them in their own words saying, this is what happened to me. It's also a matter of acknowledging that in many situations, there isn't a legal avenue. Like perhaps that 1 year has passed, right? So it's also being like, okay, so this is not the avenue, but I can still write a letter to this person and just say, hey, this is the right thing to do and here's why. You know, I can try and connect them to groups who love to call people out on Twitter and Instagram. You know, it sounds weird, but when you haven't had your paycheck in 5 weeks, it begins to feel weird that you're telling somebody else. That's not nice to call someone out on Instagram. So just acknowledging that while I have this one way that I'm going to look through all the ways to like have the result that you are demanding, it's also other ways of doing it. So how I do that in terms of family law, trying to resolve it prior to having to file, because once that happens, it actually takes the power out of all parties involved. You know, so also in terms of employment and public accommodations discrimination, like I know this is a controversial thing, but some folks are often like, don't talk about what's happening in the like in social media. And I also know for some people, it's a way that folks are able to tell their stories, like making sure that I'm getting the resources and the support I need, like as far as having clients who maybe have put something in the media about how effed up the situation is. So I'm always trying to think outside of the box. I also don't just lawyer. So I'm also doing a lot of policy work in terms of it's a way to help craft and to help draft policies that are also impacting our people. So also like the other way is, even though I don't identify as an organizer currently, I still see myself as accountable to organizing work. And that's something that I take very seriously. So I hope that answers the question in terms of like thinking of it as just more than one strategy. Oh, something else, it also means moving past like the politics of sexy. Like I think sometimes we maybe don't mean to, maybe we do, but value the cases and the work that maybe has the best fact pattern, right? Or we plaintiff shop, right? Like, and we pick plaintiffs that look good, like who maybe don't have these histories or who aren't sex workers or all of these things in these ways that, yes, I get it's reasons why people do that. And it doesn't actually get us what we want. Because if you're in the Fifth Circuit, just go for it. It's the Fifth Circuit. Bring the people who are actually the most impacted by these things. And have a strategy around. I'm not saying like just, you know, bring people without thought and care into it. So yeah. Thanks for whoever asked that question. I couldn't see.
That question was from Rebecca Holmes. And our
Thank you, Rebecca.
Our next question will be from Thomas.
Yeah, it's not much of a question. It's just an appreciation. I learned about Bacon's Rebellion, and I had a different understanding of it, and I always that's what because when you mentioned it, I was like, why would she bring that up? I thought that was just like a American Revolution. Oh, did we lose her? Oh, there she is. Sorry. American Revolution thing. But while you were talking, I looked it up and I read about it from like a different perspective that I'd never known, which was that, the rich and wealthy people got worried seeing white and black people teaming up. So they decided to separate them, which is not what I was taught. I was just taught it was like an American Revolution thing. So I just really appreciated that.
Well, you're welcome. And re-educating ourselves is lifelong work.
Yeah.
You know, and what was interesting is it was often people who are now assigned white who at the time weren't white. You know, it was people, like, it was a lot of like indigenous people, like a lot of First Nations people.
I think we'll go to our next question or comment from Suad.
Hello, Miss Moore-O'Neal. Thank you so much for
Please call me
sharing.
Mandisa.
Mandisa, of course. Thank you for sharing, and I'd love to connect with you after this. Thank you for your talk. So I have a question regarding. So you mentioned like co-opting movements and particularly the defunding. How do we push back against like corporate elites co-opting our movements and co-opting our language and holding them accountable to and standing around within like defund is not abolition, and how do we push back against that? How do we prevent that?
Sure, I pressed the wrong thing. Sorry. That's the question. One of the ways that I push back is I have to remember it's not just the corporate elites. My mama, probably right now, as I'm on here talking about abolition, is probably on Ben Zuckerberg's Facebook saying some wild ass shit about all of the things. All of the things. And so I say that to be funny, but also it's been really helpful for me to remember at the same way like the corporate elites have like put out this narrative. It's not just like the corporate elites who've internalized and manifest that narrative. Like it's people who we know, you know, it's people in our family, it's people who we love in some way. It's people who we see at the bus stop. So that's been helpful for me because of course how I would talk to a corporate elite is in how I would talk to my mama, and I have a much better opportunity to organize my mama than I do to organize Ben Zuckerberg. Because I see her every day. Well, not really because of quarantine, but I talk to her every day, and I'm much more accountable in terms of accountability is based on relationships. So I'm not saying don't engage Fox and all these people, but it's been helpful as far as for me, it's like to remember how we've internalized these messages and that it's actually more effective for me to engage in people who I'm actually in community with. And together we can do something in a way that individually it could be harder. Now, as far as when we do have opportunities to engage, perhaps someone in your family is somebody who works for a corporation like Starbucks, who's doing all kinds of wild shit. I've always found it helpful, probably because I'm married to a cultural worker. I'm married to somebody who comes from people who tell stories. That to me, it's always important to not so much share an unboundaried story or share something that you're not comfortable with, but taking it out of the numbers and taking it into this is how this impacts somebody. Like I'm always talking with people, especially around gender justice, right? where like folks have a lot of things to say about TGNC people, about trans folks in particular. And I'm always like, look, I'm not asking you to, like, Caitlyn Jenner is not someone we'll ever see in our life. I'm talking about the trans woman who catches the bus with you. I'm talking about the trans couple who live down the street. What are the things that they need in order to live their best life? Like, how do we talk about people who are like closely connected to us? Like people who are impacted by energy, and energy's bullshit. Caitlyn Jenner's not impacted by that. Even Laverne Cox, as much as I love her, she's not either. And the people in our neighborhood, the people who shop at Rouse's, even though it's fucking expensive, but it's the closest store sometimes, those are the people that I'm also trying to engage. Also think that I'm also a member of BYP 100, a chapter in New Orleans, Black people. Let's talk about it. And folks are super really good about like social media campaigns, you know, in a way that honestly, as an older youth, which is just weird, a yelder or whatever I'm called, it's an area that I'm learning like a whole lot about, like of digital organizing. I've seen that be, I haven't done it. I've seen that be super effective in terms of the call outs, not the calls, but like the engaging people in accountabilities. I also do think that with strategy, boycotting is good. I say with strategy because just announcing on Instagram to boycott is actually not a strategy. It's actually disrespectful to our ancestors who actually had strategies, AKA Baton Rouge, which is where the Montgomery boycott is based off of. That was a strategy. So I also think that, like, again, with strategy, those are super effective. Hope that answered your question, but I want to talk more, you know?
Are there any more questions? I don't see any hands or comments. Anybody else? We have time for at least one
I
more
see
question.
Grace. I see you. No? Grace, okay, I thought you were doing a little tease hand up.
I'll ask a question if no one else wants to,
Okay,
but I don't want to, you know, impinge.
go for it.
Okay. Well, so you mentioned being an abolitionist. I wanted to ask, in a abolitionist future, in a future in which abolitionist politics prevailed, does the government still employ personnel that are called to respond to a violent incident? And if so, like, who are they and what does that look like?
So the question is, in an abolitionist future, who responds to violence, basically?
Yeah.
So I'll start with this. Abolition is this weird thing that means a lot of different things. So it's definitely a long-term goal. It's something that we are working towards. It's also an organizing strategy. I believe it's also a legal strategy if folks want to get down like that. And it's also like a daily practice, or it should be. So again, there are ways like the abolitionist is a goal. And I also want to just offer, it's also a daily practice that even in a world that is centered around carcerality, we can still be abolitionists, is one thing. In that goal, like, insofar as it is a goal, I think here's where it becomes complicated. In the current construction of the US, it's not possible to achieve the goal of abolition and still have a US. It's just not. And I think that we have to just say that and just understand that when we're doing abolitionist work, it is with the idea of dismantling a country that is founded on carcerality. In the same way that I'm very clear that abolition is not possible in my lifetime, I'm also very clear I must do work as if it's possible next week. And so with that, how I believe I can model abolition and be in community with people who model abolition. And with model, I mean, part of like the first rule that I've learned, that like I've been grateful to be taught, is I'm going to fuck up. Because it's only in the carceral state that I've lived in since birth and everyone else has, is it true that if you fuck up, you're punished. That like you can't do things and have any source of redemption for them or transformation for them. So I must unlearn that by saying, I'm going to mess up, I'm going to assess them, and I'm going to come again in ways that are non-punitive. In the same way that I want grace, I have to extend grace. Now, when I say mess up, I acknowledge that violence is real. I acknowledge that grace is not the same thing as not having consequences. So I think like that's something else I see like folks get fucked up with, the idea that abolitionists aren't into consequences. If you know me, and there are 3 people on this call who do, you know I'm about consequences. Some may involve me smacking somebody. Depends on the situation. That was a joke, y'all. And the point is like consequences are a thing that don't have to be punitive. So the question for me is, how are we doing that in the here and now? Like, how are we doing our best, our part, to address violence and all the ways that violence shows up in ways that don't center the state? Like, one big way that I think it's important to always do that is to first check in with people who have been harmed, you know, who have experienced the violence. That's often something that I think is really hard. Like, oftentimes, like every situation I've been involved with, like either as an organizer, an attorney, as an advocate, folks are like, so I called the police and now I would like to move forward in this way. And the DA is telling me I have to move forward in this way. So how do we make sure that we are doing something different than that, and making sure like that people who have experienced the violence, have experienced the harm, have control in the whole process, and whatever that process means. I also think that we have to be very clear about how we deal with guilt. So in a city like New Orleans, there's a lot of interracial crime happening, right? Like it's wrongly called Black on Black and all that shit. And I've been in situations, I've experienced situations where non-Black people have actually not only not stopped the harm, have actually enabled it and continued it because I didn't know how to tell this Black person he should stop hitting his wife. I didn't want to be racist. I thought that the abolitionist thing to do was to just turn the other way. And I'm like, okay, as long as you're clear that turn the other way, man, she still got her ass beat. As you were sitting here scared to say, this is not acceptable behavior. It's like, as an abolitionist, I understand it's principles that we're all held to. That we're all held to. Even people who can check off every identity that we know is marginalized and oppressed and criminalized in this country. Because that to me is another part of the carceral state that we haven't unpacked, the ways that we as liberals play into the carcerality that like plagues us. I saw it happening, but I didn't know what to do, so I just went the other way. You know, like, especially in terms of quality of life situations. 2 years ago, I used to live in an apartment building, and my neighbor, who's now an ancestor, may he rest in power, he was a blue collar worker, and sometimes every other Friday was his payday, so he would get, you know, his Jack Daniels, and he would play Al Green at 3 a.m. It happened at least like, it happened a lot. Me and Wendy had his number. We were like, Mr. Alex 3. Can you please turn it down? Oh my God, y'all, I'm so sorry. And the first time it happened, I'll never forget. He was like, he came in our door the next day. He was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. We're like, it happens. I'm sure there's some sounds that you probably hear from our side that we don't want to talk about. But he was just so shocked. Our response was not to call the cops. And we were like, well, why would we do that? Not because we didn't know why, but it was just like, and I thought about it. I was talking to Wendy. I was like, well, look, how can that happen? The first thing that we did when he moved in is we got his number and we gave him ours, because we know it's important that the people who live on either side of our walls have ways of talking to us for any reason. You know what I mean? It's like, how do we also see abolition as this thing like that we're doing every day in terms of how are we building the community? So I didn't even have to even think about calling anyone but him. And because of the relationship, I have no problem knocking on his door and be like, Mr. Al, come on. This is not okay. What are the consequences of if you do this? There are times in which you ask me for things, not because it's a tit for tat, but because we're in community. How is you playing your music at 3 a.m., though we all love Al Green, how is this going to do something that's going to build the community that we all benefit from and need? So I also think, again, like, it's a goal, and also seeing it as something like that we are doing right now, and seeing it like also as a form of resistance. I know I mentioned abolitionist lawyering. I'm actually writing something about it, but I would say that that, again, is a lens that decenters us and is very clear on the state. You know, if I say the state, I don't mean Texas, Louisiana, I mean like our nation state, and the ways in which, again, like back to the example of the enslaved woman in the 17th century, again, just being very clear that what individual decisions, being super clear, what are the impacts these could have, and how can we then assess those impacts and be prepared to deal with them.
Thank you so much. It's now 6:01, so I think
Oh, good timing.
wrap up, but let's have a round of applause for Mandisa.
Oh, thank y'all.
And I want to thank everybody who's been with us tonight. I hope everybody will join us again next week, Thursday at 5 o'clock, for our next Imagining Victory speaker. Professor Bill Quigley will be with us next week. If anybody's not on our email list, send an email to nlg@loyola.edu to get on our email list and find out about future events. And with that, I think we'll just close out. So thanks, everybody.
Could you share my email? No. I'll put it on the bibliography, so folks can just email me the questions.
When you send us that, we'll send it out to everybody and make sure that that gets around.
And my Instagram too, because I'd love to follow people if y'all are into that. Sorry, that's kind of weird, but yeah.
We can try to facilitate that too.
Okay, y'all have a good day.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Bye, Mandisa.
Bye.